You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 49, The Gatling Gun. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Ashley Thomas.
And I'm Earl Green. Each week on Gene-ology, we fire up one of Gene Roddenberry's early pieces of TV writing to see if it'll still stand up in a fight. For ratings, of course.
And while we have each episode locked and loaded, we check to see if it contains the morals, meanings, and messages that Gene worked into his most famous later work, Star Trek. I will be back with trivia in just a moment, but first, here is how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X, formerly known as Twitter, and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, please leave us a rating or review at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. 5 stars, please, and thank you. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, this week's trivia. Earl, fire away.
Fire in the hole. Thank you very much, Ashley. And everyone, get ready to rewind. Doodly-doo, doodly-doo, doodly-doo. We interrupt our coverage of Have Gun Will Travel to turn back the clock a bit. We are now going to be spending some time covering the scripts and shows Gene was working on outside of Have Gun Will Travel, while that show was on the air. While Paladin's adventures were keeping Gene quite busy in building his visibility within the industry, the reality is that he was having to sell scripts to whoever was buying just to keep his family afloat. Gene's visibility was increased tremendously by his frequent writing credits on Have Gun Will Travel, the number 3 show on television, just a reminder. So it's perhaps not surprising that a lot of his work during this period is writing scripts for other westerns that never quite enjoyed Have Gun's high profile. Boots and Saddles ran for a single season, with 39 episodes made for the 1957-58 season. The show aired in syndication and was produced by a company called California National Productions. Location filming took place in Kanab, Utah, a city at the southern end of the state near the Arizona border, whose natural rock formations and easily accessible desert scenery earned it the nickname Little Hollywood. Boots and Saddles is actually a very minor footnote in the history of productions filming in Kanab. Better-known TV shows such as The Lone Ranger, Death Valley Days, Gunsmoke, and Daniel Boone filmed there, along with some high-profile movies, Stagecoach, Planet of the Apes, Tomahawk Trail, The Desperados, and The Outlaw Josie Wales, among many others. By the way, if you're ever in the neighborhood, a lot of this activity is commemorated in one of the town's attractions, the Little Hollywood Museum of Western Film. Boots and Saddles was created by Robert Senator, and is in fact the earliest show created by Robert. Robert's IMDb profile is likely very incomplete because Boots and Saddles is the first entry on the list, though it's not inconceivable that prior work in other media such as radio may have given him a high enough profile to create his own TV series as his first work on the small screen. He would create a number of short-lived shows during the 1960s, but would finally hit pay dirt when he and Dragnet creator Jack Webb created Adam 12, a police procedural that ran from 1968 through 75, producing 174 episodes. Midway through Adam 12's very successful run, Robert and Gene's old friend Harold Jack Bloom created the series Emergency, which was on the air from 1972 to 79. We lost Robert Senator in 1982. And yet, after a 1956 pilot film that led to some reformulation of the series concept and recasting, the first episode of Boots and Saddles to reach the air was Gene's script, which we are covering today. Boots and Saddles starred John Pickard as Captain Shanks Adams, commanding officer of the garrison at Fort Lowell, Arizona. Set in the 1870s, so to some degree contemporaneous with Have Gun Will Travel, the show involved Adams and his men having less than friendly interactions with the local Native American tribes and dealing with more humdrum issues of military life, at least through the filter of the show's time period. An unusual number of episodes also included a running element of lingering hostilities from the American Civil War. Despite the production values and the location filming and decent reviews from critics, Boots and Saddles couldn't distinguish itself in a primetime schedule that was perhaps overstuffed with westerns. Gene wrote 3 episodes that hit the air, the last of which guest starred a young DeForest Kelley, and wrote a detailed outline for a 4th script, which the show did not buy. The director for this episode was William J. Hull, Jr., a veteran TV director whose credits included 4 other episodes of Boots and Saddles, Highway Patrol, Hawaiian Eye, Bourbon Street Beat, 77 Sunset Strip, and Peyton Place. He also served as an assistant director or first AD on such later shows as Ironside, Columbo, Adam 12, David McCallum's very shagadelic 70s take on The Invisible Man, The Bionic Woman, and The Fantastic Journey. Boots and Saddles was airing in cable reruns as recently as the early 1990s, at a time when the rapid proliferation of cable channels was giving a second lease of life to a lot of black and white shows that had been out of circulation. But the show has not gotten an official DVD release at any point, and it is not streaming anywhere. We are operating from Gene's script drafts, which may or may not be what finally wound up on the air. The Gatling Gun aired on September 19th, 1957, so Boots and Saddles premiered mere days after Have Gun Will Travel premiered, and aired just over a week before Gene's first script for that show. For context, this was mere weeks after Gene's final draft of the Destiny and the Raven script for his unproduced Sam Houston series, and just a few months after Gene's last West Point episode aired.
Watkins Joshua J., born 1804. Current enlistment terminates a week from tomorrow.
Sir?
Do I have to spell it out for you, Hayes? The man is 66 years old, not 58 as he claims. He's over age for automatic reenlistment.
Sir?
In my opinion, the man is mentally unfit. You can see that in his attachment to that Gatling contraption.
Sir, since the man's in my company, I think I'm entitled to an opinion on his fitness.
Adams, I'm getting a little tired of you constantly interrupting and quarreling with Colonel Parker.
And I've always believed it was an officer's duty to voice his honest beliefs, sir.
In the 1870s, Fort Lowell is a hot spot of activity on the western frontier. Boots and Saddles is the story of its commanding officer, Captain Shank Adams, and the men of the Fifth Cavalry under his command. Act 1. Captain Shank Adams and 2 of his troopers are returning to Fort Lowell from a long patrol where they encounter a small band of Apache Indians who aren't in a mood for diplomatic relations. Adams and his men, already fatigued, pick up the pace and race for the safety of the fort. Only a last-minute appearance by more riders from the Fifth Cavalry persuades the Apaches to break off their pursuit. Adams' bacon has just been saved by his second-in-command, Lieutenant Ed Binning. But Adams wants to know where the patrol was that could have helped out sooner, the patrol that's supposed to be circling the fort according to his standing orders. Binning reveals that those orders have been countermanded. 2 days after Adams set out on his patrol, Colonel Hayes and Colonel Parker arrived from Washington and began issuing orders of their own, including standing down the perimeter patrols. Parker has been dispatched from D.C. to conduct inspections of all of the Army's forts, and has already made it clear he doesn't like what he sees at Fort Lowell. At the fort, Colonel Hayes, who visits Fort Lowell much more frequently, explains to Colonel Parker that the men see way too much action on patrol to worry about target practice, or to waste ammo on it. Parker reminds his colleague that the regs demand daily target practice, and also reminds Hayes that for some reason, Hayes keeps getting passed up for promotion. Awkward. The tension is broken by the arrival of Captain Adams asking Hayes for permission to mount a larger patrol to discourage further hostility with the local tribes, and to scatter them before they can join together into a larger fighting force that would require more men and resources to fight. This doesn't sit well with Colonel Parker, neither does Adams' dusty, mismatched uniform, as the captain has just arrived and hasn't exactly had time to change into something more in line with the regs. Adams looks to Hayes for a little bit of backup here, only to find that his superior officer seems unlikely to rock the boat with Colonel Parker around. No backup there. Let the inspection of the men begin. This interaction doesn't go much better. Parker is hung up on the men's lack of more ceremonial aspects of their uniforms, such as sabers, while Adams argues that in skirmishes with the tribes, the sabers are useless and, worse yet, actually get in the way. There's also a man missing from the formation, Corporal Watkins, an older non-commissioned man who is giving a Gatling gun the once-over. When Parker's inspection brings him to the fort's blacksmith shop, that's where Watkins can be found up to his elbows in grease and grime. Parker feels the Gatling gun is a waste of time and resources, and asks Watkins how old he is, to which the friendly corporal replies he's 58. Trying to lend Adams some support, Watkins offers his opinion that the Gatling gun has some potential in defending the fort. This only gets him a withering look from the colonel. After Adams has finally had time to wash up and change into a clean uniform, he goes to see Colonel Hayes to ask again to mount a patrol to scatter the tribes before they can unite against Fort Lowell. But Hayes refuses, and there's a tension between the two men that neither one is accustomed to. Colonel Parker shows up with paperwork indicating that Watkins is not 58 years old, but is instead 66, and is not eligible to re-enlist. His current enlistment is over in a week, and Parker wants him gone, believing that Watkins' attachment to the Gatling gun is proof that he is mentally unfit to keep serving. Adams argues with the colonel. Adams is the commander of the fort, he knows his own men, and believes Watkins still has something to contribute. But during parade drills, Adams treats Watkins differently, as if he's a fresh-faced recruit with everything to prove. Seeing another corporal getting the Gatling gun mounted for target practice, Watkins tries to offer some friendly advice, only to have that advice dismissed. Watkins continues with the parade drills, his attention divided between those and his pet project, finally asking his second to take over. He's put too much work into the Gatling gun to see it be test-fired poorly. A line of empty bottles has been set up for Colonel Parker to put in some target practice, but unaware that the colonel is out there, Watkins opens fire with the Gatling gun, reducing those targets to dust. Watkins is overjoyed that the gun he's modified worked so well, but he almost shot the colonel, who is heading this way to have a word. None too pleased. Whoops. Act 2. Another day brings another bugle call at Fort Lowell. Corporal Watkins, decked out in civvies that his fellow soldiers pitched in to buy for him, is on his way to enjoy civilian life. He's been drummed out of the service. Though he seems to have been in no hurry to leave the army, Watkins is reflective. He's at least made it out of uniform alive. Not all of the men he's known could say the same. The supply wagon to Tucson pulls up. Watkins ride home, but he's upset when he sees the Gatling gun loaded into the wagon, also on its way to be decommissioned. Watkins will also be riding with the two colonels, and Adams and his officers fear that Hayes will never return to Fort Lowell after this trip. As soon as he's off base, Colonel Parker will have an easy time convincing Washington to reassign Hayes. And there's some resentment toward Watkins. His test firing of the Gatling gun only cemented Colonel Parker's resolve to remove the thing. But as they stride out to the supply wagon, it's clear that the colonels are poppin'. Hayes is finally standing up to Parker, reminding him that life on the frontier, where it seems Fort Lowell seldom has the support, manpower, or resources to do its job, is about more than adherence to minor regulations. That's when Parker makes it very clear that as far as he's concerned, Hayes is leaving Fort Lowell forever. Adams and his men will ride alongside the supply wagon as armed escort. And that's a good thing, because the moment it leaves Fort Lowell, the wagon makes a tempting target for the Apaches. Adams notices the activity, but Watkins, feeling as though he's to blame for everyone's troubles with Colonel Parker, is too wrapped up in his own thoughts to notice. The driver of the wagon tries to cheer him up, pointing out that a civilian outranks those in the military. Finally, having spotted enough trail signs and finally seeing a smoke signal in the distance, Adams orders the convoy to come to a stop. They are almost certainly going to be attacked by a force that outnumbers them, and the terrain here offers more options for cover than if they keep pressing onward. Parker is annoyed that he is being held up, and at this point, Adams makes it pretty clear he's getting tired of Colonel Parker. Colonel Hayes is stunned. The armed escort dismounts and prepares for a fight. The two colonels and Watkins remain with the wagon. Parker continues insisting that Adams and his men should take the offensive, while Hayes argues that Parker's West Point textbook tactics aren't worth a damn out here. Then Watkins, who has already been discharged, gives Colonel Parker a piece of his mind. Watkins has seen brass like Parker come and go, while he and the enlisted men around him continued to be the backbone of the army. Watkins also thinks Hayes should be more forceful in backing up Captain Adams. Well, that sure lightened the mood, and it's last call for casual conversation because here come the Apaches. More of them than expected, a lot more. The Apaches have the army escort outnumbered 2-1. Adams asks Hayes, not Parker, for permission to unload the Gatling gun and get it ready. It might be the only ace in the hole that they have. Parker starts recommending vainglorious tactics that are certain to lead to a bloodbath, and Hayes finally pushes back because, honestly, they're all likely to end up dead in a few minutes. Adams asked Corporal Watkins, retired, to man the Gatling gun, but as a civilian, Watkins isn't allowed near it. It's Army property. Unless, of course, he could re-enlist. Colonel Hayes points out that some minor regulations forbid him from allowing that, but Colonel Parker, gripped with fear, says something stunning. Never mind the regs, get that man sworn back in and behind the gun. Watkins gets to work prepping the gun for combat after the indelicate handling it received being loaded into the wagon. When given the order, Watkins opens fire, and it turns out the old soldier and his old Gatling gun still have something to offer. The Apaches scatter and abandon their attack. Later, the supply wagon returns to Fort Lowell with the Gatling gun, with Corporal Watkins back on active duty, and with Colonel Hayes. Adams starts to apologize about his earlier remarks to the colonel, to which Hayes replies, "I heard no remarks that weren't in order at the time." And life at Fort Lowell resumes, as close to normal as life on the frontier can get. The end, but also just the beginning.
Awesome recap, Earl. Thank you for handling that today.
Thank you. I certainly try to keep that one comprehensive because we don't actually have the episode to watch. So that one may have been a bit wordier than some of my recent Have Gun recaps, but all because I'm trying to get as much of the story in people's heads so they can imagine it, if nothing else.
You were laying down suppressing fire with that.
Yeah, and that's really what that's good for. I mean, it's a good deterrent to have, and I think they kind of landed on that in the show as well. Which, brings us to this. Seeing an actual Gatling gun, I mean, a manually cranked one, being fired, that's probably quite a thrill for 1957 TV. Because I don't imagine that was too common a sight in 57.
Probably not.
The first Gatling gun was developed in 1860 and was used during the Civil War, but it saw more use in the Spanish-American War and in a particularly dark chapter of domestic history was used against striking railroad workers in Scranton, Pennsylvania during the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, so not a good use of the Gatling gun there. But for there to still be a working specimen in the 1950s, that's kind of impressive.
Yeah, and so do we know for certain they used a real one? A real one? Or did I miss that in our notes?
That, I don't know. However, the script makes so many notes of it having been fired. Surely they did. Either that or this script was changed significantly between Gene's second draft and the final shooting script, which I should bring up on the subject of script revisions. We can taste the rainbow in this one. There are blue revised pages dated July 15th, 1957, pink revised pages dated July 24th, 1957, and just a handful of white pages remaining in between those two, which I'm guessing those were the original draft, for which we have no specific date. So it looks like this script was kicked back to Gene for some significant rewrites, and we'll get into the weeds that later, because I think I know one of the things that was significantly changed, kind of reading between the lines.
That's interesting observation there, my friend. I'm looking forward to getting your take on that. The image of an older fella with his grease up to his elbows working on this gun, growing up in an area where a lot of the older men in my life, like my dad, my uncles, and grandfathers, like, you know, out tinkering in the garage with something, and have their elbows being up to their elbows in grease. That's I had a pretty good picture of what that looked like. I imagined the older fella whose name is escaping me.
Watkins,
thank you. Watkins looked a lot like my papa in my head.
Yeah, he kind of looked like my grandpa to me. Maybe not quite as old as when I knew my grandpa on my dad's side. But, you know, very much. There was either a car that hadn't run for years that was still in the process of being surgically dissected. Because, you know, it will run someday again.
Yeah.
You know, that was always the promise. Never saw that car. I never saw that car move.
Yeah.
You know, or, you know, some lawnmower turned upside down and splayed out like a frog in biology class. But yeah, it's a vibe, and I feel like our generation, it could be our generation is one of the last to have that in our heads, as this is how we remember our fathers and our uncles and our grandfathers, or our older brothers, maybe.
Yeah, that was a really distinct image. I was like, oh yeah, I know what that looks like.
Yeah. I think everyone of a certain age probably has that memory in their head. Probably not a bad memory, unless you were asked to hold the flashlight, and then it all went to hell.
Why are you shining it there?
Yeah, see, also part of the package, part of the experience. Hopefully everyone's flashlight trauma has healed. After the absolute gem that was Charlie Red Dog, keep in mind that show was from the end of 1959. I have to admit, it took the wind out of my sails just a little bit to see Gene writing very standard Cowboys versus Indians Western here. Did you get that?
That was definitely a shocker. I was fully expecting some sort of, oh yeah, we need to, make peace or whatever, and that was not what we got with this episode. I was kind of unpleasantly surprised by that.
Yeah, but it's someone else's show. They've crafted the formula for it. They have decided what the tone is going to be, and if you're a TV writer and you're not on staff, if you're a freelancer, because this was after Gene had lost the staff writing gig on West Point because the show did not continue past season 1. This is the job. You pitch your best story, you make the sale, you deliver the script, book the gig. Rinse and repeat. It might just be a living, so Gene is not always given the luxury of the kind of creative wiggle room to leave his mark. However, I felt there was something here about ageism.
Yeah.
Maybe in a very broad and obvious way, but so there is some meat here to dig into once we get into our discussion. And I would like to think that a light bulb has already gone off over everyone's heads because they know which episode of Star Trek this also leads us to.
Part of the reason this guy looked like my papaw in my head was like, he's 66 and still enlisted in the Army. I'm like, I understand regulations were probably different back then, but, I think, I don't know what the retirement age for military is, but I imagine it's, at least for active duty, like mid-40s or so. Or most folks at least retire from around that age. I can't imagine being 66 and still in the military.
Well, you kind of get the impression that Corporal Watkins is a very capable mechanic.
Mm-hmm.
And even in those days, that's a skill that's got to be in demand.
True.
So I am sure they were happy for him to stay put as long as he wanted to keep re-enlisting.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of ranks, kind of the tip-off that there were a lot of revisions in this script. The unrevised pages, the white pages in the script, there are a couple of places where they say that Parker is a general and not a colonel. Now, I have a feeling that was a major reason for revising the script, because it has to be dramatically believable. But if Colonel Hayes is just a colonel and Parker is a full 4-star general, that's 4 more stars than Hayes has on his shoulder.
Right.
Or on his collar. And so even if Parker is a 1-star brigadier general, any pushback from Hayes is going to get stepped on pretty quickly as gross insubordination. So it's a bit more believable to have them lock horns if they are right next to each other in rank. And so maybe Parker is a full colonel, maybe Hayes is a lieutenant colonel. Hayes is still outranked, but he has more room to hold his own against Parker than he would if Parker was a general. Hayes or Adams pushing back against Parker as a general would be career suicide.
Yeah.
In the immediate post-Civil War years, the number of colonels in the Army dropped significantly. So, Parker and Hayes are both still in some rarefied air rank-wise. But here, this way, they are close enough that there can be some pushback, there can be some disagreement. And it's not an end to the career of Colonel Hayes. Now, Adams might not have lucked out so much if not for the fact that everybody joins up and basically saves Parker's butt. Big time.
Yeah.
And their own. They're all still alive at the end of the day. But Parker has no idea what to do because he is... the term that they use repeatedly in the script is he is a book soldier. Which means he has seen very little actual action. So all of his tactical knowledge came to him in the classroom and not on the field. And so he's kind of doing the equivalent of telling them, don't send in a resume, demand to see the manager. Well, you demand to see the manager of the Apaches, you're probably not going to walk away from that.
All right,
so,
Corporal Karen.
Yeah, slow your roll.
I did a Google. According to ye olde Google, the mandatory retirement age for active military is 64 years old. You will retire exactly on the first day of the month after your birthday month.
One of my high school classmates is still active. I'm 52, so he's got to be 51 or 52 himself. And I look upon him with admiration and amazement because, dude, doesn't your back hurt? Because I know mine hurts.
And I imagine stuff like that is probably more in the training classroom sort of deal.
Oh, he deployed in the past 2 years.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, wow.
That's
impressive.
That's completely unfathomable to me. I have a cousin that's in the military, and he just got back from Africa somewhere, and but he's like also 11 years younger than me. So I'm just like, yeah, you got it, buddy. You go right ahead. Enjoy seeing the world. Hope everything's okay.
64. Wow. Was it 64 back then, or is it 64 now?
It is 64 now.
Okay.
But he's 66 and he's passing for 58.
Well, this would have presented a unique problem for a casting director in the 1950s, because back then everyone looked older.
It's true. They have to get somebody that looked like Methuselah.
So, yeah, who knows what this looked like. Unfortunately, IMDb has very little information on who was in this episode.
Wow.
I was lucky to be able to find out who the director was. That information doesn't necessarily exist for every episode of Boots and Saddles. So, yeah, again, we are dealing with a show that is, if it isn't already lost media, it's right on the cusp of it. And
right.
I wish someone would fix that, not just because I want to see Gene's episodes, but it just feels like this is the sort of thing that should be preserved. Dissecting one of these where we don't have the show is kind of a different challenge, Ashley, and welcome to doing that, by the way, kind of throwing you in the deep end here.
Yeah, I realized as I was reading the script, first of all, I had never read a script before.
Really?
So I have somehow managed to not do that. So this was really fun and interesting to see, okay, this is how the writer helps set up these shots and all of these sorts of things. So I appreciated that, but it also... it made me realize just how much I take in visually from storytelling versus what I process when I read things with my eyes. I kind of jokingly say I don't read books with my eyes anymore, but it's kind of true. So sitting down to read this was like it was using different muscles in my brain that I hadn't used in a while. Because yes, I read, but if I'm reading a book, it's got to be audiobook. Otherwise, I can't sit still long enough to read it or retain most of the information. So reading this was a particular and good and interesting challenge for me. Let's put it that way.
So I'm kind of curious as to what parts of the script format surprised you the most in a good or bad way.
I mean, definitely nothing bad, but also realizing, because there's a certain amount that is directed in terms of what the final product looks like. This is how you were told to set up the scene. I don't think I realized how much control the writer had over that versus the director. I had always kind of assumed like the director reads the dialogue. I was expecting mostly just dialogue versus set direction. Fade ins, fade outs. I wasn't anticipating that at all.
Right, and to some extent, even casting from the script, specifying that Watkins has to look a certain age. And, specifying details of things like Adams is wearing pieces of two different uniforms because, as my mom used to say, necessity is a mother. Feels like there's another word after that, but I've forgotten what it was. A lot of it, it's all in the script. I mean, you think about stage plays and things like that. If the writer does not specify this stuff, you don't know what to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Nope. That's all of that was really fascinating for me to experience for the first time. So I think the next one, I'm going to have a better feel for what to anticipate, look for, that sort of thing.
And it'll be really interesting because fairly soon we're going to have some shows that the shows do exist in the archive, as do the scripts, and then we can compare and contrast a bit. Now, anyone who follows the fictional universe that Gene Roddenberry created will recognize this story immediately, because it's kind of a universal story that is continually retold on so many shows, in so many different ways. This is the Boots and Saddles version of Relics. Watkins is Scotty. It's that simple.
Yeah, no, he definitely is. And I hadn't registered that until you mentioned it earlier in our show. So I'm like, oh yeah, it's that one episode with Scotty. That's a good catch. I kind of took it as someone who has worked in retail management, kind of the disconnect between those doing the work and upper management. Unfortunately, my retail management experience was quite bad through no fault of my own, and I was lucky that I had a regional manager who gave pushback and tried to help, but the upper management wouldn't have it. Like, no, you have to do it this way. And I was like, practically, this is not working. And all of these stores are performing poorly because you have given them unrealistic goals and unreasonable expectations, and you have not equipped them to be able to do their job. So, yeah, it was very bad. That company doesn't exist anymore, and with good reason, because lots of horrible mismanagement. So, kind of that disconnect between the people actually doing the work and the people who are sitting in offices telling you how you should do the work. You know, understanding how practically that doesn't always line up.
Yeah, and even if you narrow it down to just the kind of the military aspects and implications of it, you have in Colonel Parker someone who, it doesn't matter how much ground truth everyone around him is trying to give him, he's not willing to take any of it on board. You know, it's his way or the highway, and he is almost kind of a caricature in that respect. That unwillingness to take on new information. Of course, I say that. And, you know, we have people now who just deny science. And they deny science on computerized communication systems powered by satellites and cell phones. Because science is bad. Okay. But, you know, here you have someone who is unwilling to take on any new information and almost gets his butt handed to him as a result. Which, if it was just him, well, good luck, sir. But it's not just him. It's everyone around him trying to protect him, and he's not being any help at all. And, you know, that's the point at which I'm like, you know what? You get out front. You know, you want to see the charge, why don't you lead the charge?
Go right ahead, see what happens. Have fun.
Yeah. Now, mess around and find out. There's another word that's supposed to be in that sentence. I keep forgetting what it is. Now, it's not a news story by any stretch of the imagination. You know, I don't think that Ronald D. Moore ran across a rerun of Boots and Saddles somewhere and said, oh, yeah, I should write a Star Trek like that. A lot of shows have told this basic story. Yeah, a lot of them. And it's probably been a very special episode, toothpaste commercial, ding, on many of these shows.
Yeah.
Kind of a sad comment on society that whether the subject is military service or someone's working life, we have to keep telling this story over and over again because things don't change. It's kind of funny because as much as I don't want to tie our podcast down to 2024, and I really, really don't want to tie it down to the election, retirement age is this weirdly paradoxical talking point right now in the current campaign. We have the same people simultaneously saying, well, let's push retirement age into the 70s. At the same time, they're telling people younger than that, hey, leave your kids with their grandparents so you can work 3 or more part-time jobs to make ends meet. But wait a minute, their grandparents are also supposed to be working and vying for these same part-time jobs, so which is it? the problem in either school of thought, for or against that, is that retirement age is not a one-size-fits-all solution. As some people are ready to keep going well past, what the written shelf date is that society, or at least government, has agreed on. Some people are aiming for the big 6-5 with all of their might, because that is their finish line. Others may have the means and the desire to retire sooner. Hey, nice work if you can get it. As some of us, for whatever reason, we're not going to have the option of, I'm going to decide I don't work anymore, because we're going to have to keep going until we drop. I kind of suspect that last category is an uncomfortably large percentage of the population these days. But just setting one number, even if you do it with the best and kindest of intentions, seems like it's oversimplifying the situation, especially when you have people trying to set policy, decide, we're going to move that number around. The realities of military service in the 19th century were very different than they are now. Early retirement has become kind of a carrot that gets dangled before people who have devoted their lives to military service, especially if we are going through one of these socio-political or economic times that have made a military force reduction necessary, or perhaps just, hey, this would be a good idea to do. If Watkins is in his 60s and still serving, okay, dude's a lifer.
Yeah.
The Army is the only life he has ever known. And with more time to tell the story, if this was an hour show, it seems like there could have been room to address that. Can he even adjust to civilian life, given how long he's been enlisted? But this is TV from a much simpler time. The format of the Western demands that we play a bit of Cowboys and Indians at some point before the end credits roll. And it's just kind of amazing, this kick to the head, having just covered El Paso stage and Alice. And then we're back to this. But it was only 2 years before. And it seems like in that 2 years, the amount of complexity of story and character that Gene was able to squeeze into half an hour. Wow. A lot changed in 2 years.
Yeah, I had the good fortune a few years ago, I say a few years ago, I'm realizing now it was probably 10 years ago, I got to meet author John Scalzi at a convention. Super nice guy. I had just started working as a freelancer, and I told him, so, I know you're an author, but did you, when you were starting out, did you do other kinds of writing as well? And he's like, yeah, I did. I told him what I did, and he's like, well, all writing is practice.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter what kind of writing you're doing. If you're doing copywriting, or if you're writing blog posts, if you're writing articles, if you're writing fiction, all writing is practice. And it all translates no matter what kind of writing you're doing.
Yeah, and, going back to these instances where it doesn't seem like there's a huge amount of Gene in a Gene Roddenberry script. Yeah, as we pointed out back in the days of, Norm and I covering Highway Patrol and Mr. District Attorney, sometimes you just gotta hold your nose, block the stench, cash the check, go home and pay the bills. Mm-hmm. That's how it's done. I don't think this is a bad script. It just seems very simplistic compared to, even the early Have Gun Will Travel episodes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a very by the numbers sort of story. And you said it, it's one that we've seen a lot in a lot of different formats across decades of TV and film.
Right. And, it's always worth keeping in mind, maybe this was the first time it cropped up in TV storytelling, although I kind of doubt that. Because I have a feeling that this is a topic that has probably been dealt with on stage before there was TV. It may have been dealt with in radio. It almost certainly has been dealt with in print by this point. So there's not a lot new here. There's not a lot that's daring. It's not bad.
Yeah.
But it's no Charlie Red Dog.
No. I mean, that's a fairly high bar, but even so.
It's also, sort of like we talked about in Charlie Red Dog, it's not Gene's fault that they made up a white guy to play a Native American protagonist. Yeah, I'm sure Gene's script didn't specify that. That was just the playbook of Hollywood at the time. A couple of actors I could name who wound up getting made up like that a lot because they had a, slightly off-kilter look, despite being Caucasian, would be Robert Lansing, a.k.a. Gary Seven. Some guy named Leonard Nimoy also got to play a lot of Native American roles. So that's neither here nor there, but, the casting was not Gene's. Gene handed in a script. He was not the casting director. Gene was not the creator or producer or showrunner of this show. He just handed in a script. And so if the show's formula insists that, anytime Native Americans show up, they're just basically the equivalent of Mongol hordes to be driven off, that's how this show does its thing. Gene can't change that. As a freelancer, you're not in a position to say, oh, this is terrible, you should do this. Well, go create your own show. And then, of course, later he did. Okay, Ashley, we have rolled the Gatling gun back into the blacksmith shop. I'm sure Watkins will want to oil it up, keep tinkering with it some more. While he's doing that, what is your takeaway from your first experience with boots and saddles?
Well, it's definitely of its time. We've got Army versus Native Americans, and it's just a really simplistic view of that relationship.
Yeah, no nuance whatsoever.
All the nuance of a baseball bat,
Yeah.
I don't think it was a bad script, but, it didn't feel a ton like signature Gene, what we have come to know as signature Gene via Star Trek and things like that. It's, if anything, the ageism message kind of holds true into later things like Star Trek. Of course, we talked about relics already. For me, and maybe it's just my experience, the whole upper management versus the workers kind of rang a little more true for me. And I think that's mostly my experience with that playing into my interpretation. So what about you?
Yeah, it's very, very simple. Like we pointed out, this was from a time that Gene had just come off of West Point, which went no further than its first season, and was, I'm sure, casting about for any work he could find, having just lost the first staff writer job, which there is some safety in being a staff writer. You're participating in the making of the show regardless of whether you have written it that week or not. You still get to weigh in. And without that underneath him, Gene's back to freelancing, and occasionally that means turning in something like this that is about as nuanced as, hey, ageism is bad, clueless management is bad, and this being roughly contemporaneous with the Sam Houston project that never got off the ground, which had all sorts of things about understanding and respect of Native American culture. Yeah, I feel like, boy, we took the gig because he was young, he needed the money. It's not a bad script. I mean, he did what he could within the strictures of this show, but it's not going to go down as a Gene Roddenberry classic.
I was wondering, with the interactions with the Apaches, did any of that get changed? Like, did Gene have something a little more meaty in here versus Just the standard paint by numbers, us versus them?
Probably not. I'm going to hazard a guess that was never in the offing, probably because he had already seen a writer's Bible for the show, which is the document that basically tells you, here is how to write for this show. This is who the characters are. This is the setting. This is what we do want to see. This is what we don't want to see.
Fair enough.
And so he had probably gotten the message loud and clear from the writer's Bible or whatever briefing he received from, what was the showrunner's name, Robert Senator? That we're not giving any nuance to the native characters. That they are a foil, they're a background threat that's always there. We are not going to negotiate with them. That's not what this show is here to do. And in cases like that, all you can do is just kind of sigh to yourself and say, okay, what story can I tell within that?
Right.
And so we get into this whole ageism thing. And even then, it seems like there are some beats that were missed. If army life is all that Watkins knows, what does this say about work-life balance? Or, is his entire social life within the barracks? Even if it is, who are we to judge that? Because it does not seem to me, from the reading of the script, it doesn't look like Watkins was looking forward to civilian life. He seemed very depressed about it.
Yeah, Mike, does he have family or anyone outside of this? And I'm going to guess probably not. If he's that old and in the military, then no, this is probably all he's got.
Yeah, all he's got is the other guys in the barracks. That's his whole life. It's probably why he did not want to be escorted out the doors of the fort.
Yeah.
And so even with Watkins, it seems like there was a more detailed and nuanced story waiting to be told. But instead we get these kind of caricatured senior officers who don't have any idea what's happening on the ground and don't care. I mean, that's as stereotypical senior officer as you can get. And what's more, if you think about it, that is a stereotype that carries forward into Star Trek. See also every Badmiral or every Commissioner Robert Fox, that actor that we saw recently in Have Gun. Very much cut from the same cloth. I know what's best. I don't care about what information you have. I'm not going to pay attention to it anyway. I know what's best. There's nothing here that's up there with the greats from Gene's back catalog. It's barely worth remembering, but because we are trying to cover all of his work and give everything a fresh viewing if we have it, or a fresh reading if we don't, if we just have the script in this case, just so we don't miss anything. And sadly, the end result is this story feels eminently missable.
Kind of like a Gatling gun?
Yes. If there was a point to the story, then somebody was shooting wide of the mark. Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Special thanks to the Roddenberry Repertory Players. Our cast this week featured Jeff Gauntt as Captain Shank Adams, Kyle Clark as Colonel Hayes, and Kerstan Szczepanski as Colonel Parker. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com.
On the next Gene-ology, the Prussian farmer. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Rand Hurl, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.